Monday 13th, June 1864, is a day that I shall remember for the rest of my life. On that day, I received a letter from Obadiah Sims, an uncle of mine whom I had not seen in over 20 years. My late father had told me some years ago that his brother had dropped out of society and bought a large house in Yorkshire, and had told his friends and family that he wanted to be left alone to study his passion for the occult. In the letter, Obadiah pleaded for me to come immediately as he urgently needed my help. He said that all would be explained on my arrival. Directions to his house were enclosed. I was extremely intrigued by the letter. I would go and see what I can do to help him. He lived in a property near the small isolated village of Barstow in Yorkshire, and so I boarded a train to Yorkshire the following day. What on earth did he mean by urgently needing my help? He had not communicated with any member of the family for such a long time, but I must be patient and wait until I see him. As he said in his letter, that would be explained on my arrival. The train eventually pulled into a small station at the Hayton Pacey, where I hired the driver of a pony and a trap to take me to the last few miles to Obadiah's house near Barstow. The driver at first seemed reluctant to take me at all, and only agreed if I accepted that he would only take me as far as the gates to the house. Nothing I could say, even to offering him a substantial tip, would make him change his mind. The summer sun was sinking lower in the sky as we flew along the narrow country lanes. Even the horse seemed to sense urgency of his master. We passed into Barstow, a small village of cottages built of local Yorkshire stone, where the driver stopped at the Three Feathers Inn with the excuse,
"We need refreshments for the horse, sir."
I took advantage of this break in the journey to ask some questions of the landlord regarding Obadiah. He was hesitant to talk about him at first, but after I had bought him a large whiskey, he told what he knew. It seems that at one time Obadiah, an eccentric solitary man, was liked by the villagers. Then suddenly, one day a dark shadow came over the village, and strange unnatural howlings were heard coming from the area of Obadiah's house. Terrible happenings suddenly started to occur in the surrounding area, and cattle and sheep were found ripped apart as if by some huge creature. Obadiah at this point stopped coming to the village, and the rumors and gossiping started. Suitably refreshed, my driver and his horse were ready and eager now to finish the journey, and so we set off again at a fast pace, and after a mile or so further on, the driver came to a halt in front of a pair of tall metal gates.
"This is as far as I go, sir."
I tried very hard to get him to take me on to the house, but there was no way that I could persuade him to go any further. In fact, he pleaded with me to let him take me back to the village, especially as nightfall was fast approaching. He said,
"I will return to these gates tomorrow at midday if you wish to return to the village."
As I watched the horse in the trap disappear, I began to feel very alone and strangely uneasy. I picked up my suitcase, opened the gates, and began to walk up the winding drive. On either side, the once cultivated grounds had become overgrown, the shrubs and flowers now a smothered, tangled mess. The house came into view somehow sooner than I expected. It was very old, 16th century, and had been built on the ruins of an old 12th century Cistercian abbey. The walled beams of the house were discolored and damaged due to centuries of dampness and neglect. Weeds clung to the house in an unnatural embrace, as if thriving on some unseen nourishment from below. Tree growth covered part of the tiled roof, and the windows looked dark and uninviting. The gate to the house hung limply on one hinge. Pushing it open, I walked up the weed-strewn pathway to the large oak front door, which still appeared solid and secure. I wondered how the inside had fared. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the house, but there was no response. Perhaps Obadiah was occupied elsewhere. I knocked again, this time a lot harder, still no response, but the force of my knocking had pushed open the door. A smell of mustiness and dampness of years of airlessness made me cough and reach for my handkerchief. The way in was along a small flagstone passageway with oak-paneled walls which led into a large hall. There was very little light coming through the high windows on each side due to the dust and grime, but even so I could just make out a long oak table on which were plates with scraps of food still on them. Old candlesticks were set in the center and at each end. The whole scene was covered in several inches of dust and cobwebs. Damp, mildewed portraits still hung at odd angles on the wall, their occupants' faces staring out, unblinking on this scene of desolation and neglect. At the far end of the hall, I could make out in the gloom a wide staircase which curved upwards. To the right of the staircase, and in the corner of the hall, a bad leak in the roof had allowed water in, and the wall was green with mold all the way down to the floor. I decided to investigate further before the daylight faded completely and see what rooms there were at the top of the staircase. I passed more portraits on the stairs in a similar state to those in the hall. Brushing cobwebs from my face, I reached the top, and a long corridor ran out for what I assumed to be the length of the house. I found the room on either side of the corridors were empty but deep in dust, except one which still contained an old 4-poster bed. 2 ancient chairs and a table in the center completed the furniture. This must be where Obadiah slept, but there was still no sign of him, and the late afternoon shadows were getting longer as evening drew near. After half an hour, I had searched the whole house and found no sign of Obadiah, so I decided to return to his bedroom where I left my luggage. It was very odd, but on entering the room I found a difficulty in keeping my eyes open. My eyelids seemed strangely heavy, and so I thought perhaps a few minutes rest on a bed would refresh me after my long journey. The bed was indeed very comfortable, and in a few seconds I had fallen asleep, and as I slept I became aware of a voice, and the figure of an old man appeared by my bed, his hands clasped together.
Thank goodness, you have come. Help me. Please, you must help me.
Then I heard a deep growling noise echoing behind him, and turned with a look of such fear on his face, and disappeared. But morning came with still no sign of Obadiah, and finding no food in the house, except for the stale remnants left on a table in the hall. I remembered that the driver had said he would return to the gates at midday, so I thought it best to return to the village, find some food, and have further talks with the landlord, then decide what to do next. The driver was patiently waiting.
Good day, sir. I hoped you would be here. I didn't think you would survive the night. This place is cursed,
he said, as I climbed aboard the trap and we made our way back to Barstow. Once back at the Three Feathers Inn, I ordered a large breakfast and asked the landlord if he would join me and tell me more about Obadiah and the house and what had caused the villagers to be so scared. Unfortunately, he could only repeat what he had already told me, that all was well with Obadiah and the villagers until one night frightening sounds were heard and the animal killings started. He suggested that I might find out more about the origins of the house from the village church archives. Just a short walk from the inn, the church of St. Peter was beautifully set in a slight hollow. I was accompanied by the local church warden, who was only too pleased to show me his church's treasures. The room was very small with just enough light coming in from a tiny window, enabling me to see the row of old books and papers pertaining to the history of the church, the village, and the surrounding countryside. I explained to the warden that I was interested in what might be known of the history of the old house that my uncle Obadiah lived in. The warden showed me the books that he thought would interest me, which gave details on the day-to-day runnings of the church and information about Barstow over the last 500 years. Then he said that there was a small book on the top shelf that had been of peculiar interest to my uncle, and reaching up, he brought down a dust-covered black leather book, which he said was the history of the ruined Cistercian Abbey. He then said that he had to rush off on urgent church business, and that I could take the book away to read at my leisure. I thanked him and assured him that I would take good care of it. Returning to the Three Feathers, I felt a certain excitement that I couldn't wait to begin reading about the ruined Abbey, and so I asked the landlord if he had a room for the night, as time was passing and the driver of the pony and trap would not take me back to the house after dark. The landlord was only too happy to oblige. Eager to retire to my bed, I went to my room early that night and quickly settled down with the book. The book told the story of the Abbey and its founding in 1128 as the Abbey of Barstow. For many years, the order followed the strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict. Then, after an order of Cistercian nuns was taken in by the abbot, immorality and debauchery became rife amongst a small number of monks and nuns. But one monk in particular, named Bernard de Riche, he had the taste for even greater depravity after he had discovered a book in the Abbey crypt. Unbeknown to him, he was to unwittingly open the door to something evil. Outside my room, the wind was howling, a storm was brewing. I jumped from my bed to ensure the window shutters were secure. Then, returning to my book, the writer went on to say that Bernard de Riche had opened the book, then he disappeared. He was nowhere to be found even after a thorough search of the Abbey and the grounds. It was then, on the first night of the following full moon, the villagers first heard the blood-curdling howls of a large wolf. In the morning, the part remaining of cattle and sheep were found, savaged, and their throats ripped open. At that moment, I dropped the book, remembering what the landlord had told me when I first asked him about Obadiah. He told me that unnatural howling sounds were heard coming from Obadiah's house, and animals had been found horribly mutilated, with their throats ripped open. Was there a connection between the happenings of over 600 years ago and now? The idea seemed just too fantastic, and at the same time more than a little frightening. Continuing with my book, the storyteller recounted that after several more terrible happenings with two villagers were being murdered in the most horrible way and livestock being ripped apart, a rumor spread through the village that the evil emanated from the Abbey. For the monks, debauched behavior was well known in the village, so it was that of one winter's evening a mob from the village descended on the Abbey and burnt it to the ground. The monks and the nuns who escaped the blaze fled to the nearest abbey at York. After the fire, the charred body of a very tall man had been discovered in the crypt. The missing monk, Bernard de Riche, was well known for his exceptional height. The villagers' fear of the abbey had seemed well founded and their drastic actions vindicated, because the evil happening ceased from that moment. It was well after midnight when I put down the book. There must surely be a link between what happened in the 12th century and what was happening now. With those thoughts running through my mind, I tried to get some sleep. Sleep was fitful, tossing and turning, with images of screaming monks and nuns running for their lives from a monstrous wolf who, towering over them, scooped them up in his giant paws and stuffed them into its gaping jaws, which were dripping with blood. Then through these sounds of hell, I heard the voice of Obadiah crying out to me.
Thank goodness you've come. You must help me. But first, please listen to what I have to say. All my life I've been obsessed with witchcraft and the occult, and I had heard of the old Abbey of Barstow, and the rumors surrounding its demise, which is the reason why I purchased the house in the Abbey grounds. I was also aware of the story of Christopher de Courcy, and the book had been given by the devil, and the legend that after his execution, the book had been spirited to a Cistercian abbey in Yorkshire. After many years, my research led me to this old abbey of Barstow, and after my visit to the St. Peter's Church in the village, the readings, the small book on the abbey's history, I knew I was right. I spent years digging in the abbey's ruins looking for where Bernard de Riche may have hidden the book, and finally I found it. Digging in an area close to where the abbey's altar would have been, I came across the large stone slabs just below the surface. Moving them to one side revealed a set of stone steps winding down into the ground. Returning to the house for a lantern, I then descended into what was the abbey's crypt. Holding my lantern high, I will make out that the crypt was quite small, the light throwing up grotesque shadows on the walls. There were 2 rows of 3 pillars each, either side of a central aisle, holding up a vaulted roof. At the end, furthest from the entrance, I could make out a mound of earth, which looked like the shape of a grave. Remembering that the villagers of Barstow had found the charred body of Bernard de Riche in a crypt all those years ago, dare I hope that perhaps they had reburied him there. In excitement, I dug into the ground with my bare hands, and a few inches down, I found the blackened leg bones of a skeleton. Moving upwards, I began to reveal the rest of the skeleton of a very tall man. There was no doubt in my mind that this was the skeleton of de Riche, but I couldn't see the book until, on lifting the skull, the back of my hand brushed against something else in the ground. With my trembling hands, I moved the skull to one side, dug down under where the head had lain, and there it was before my eyes, the devil's book, that had once belonged to Christopher de Courcy. Brushing off the damp soil when picking up the lantern, I rushed from the crypt clutching my treasure. By now night had fallen, the sky was clear and the moon was full. Once back in the hall, I could make out 2 words written in Latin on the cover: Apere me, open me. The book was bound by 2 metal clasps, and with some difficulty I broke the clasps and opened the book. Inside were written 2 further words in Latin: Dimite me, release me. On the facing page was the frightening image of a gigantic figure with a wolf's head, exuding total evil. On the last page, 2 final words: Combaret igni, burn me. Turning back to the page opposite, the huge werewolf, before I had realized what I was doing, I spoke the 2 words, Dimite me, my voice echoing throughout the house. It was then that I remembered. It was the night of the full moon. What have I done? As I stood there in the hall, I was suddenly aware that something dreadful was happening to me. I was becoming the picture in the book, that of a gigantic werewolf, and on the night of each full moon, I am destined to terrorize the countryside, to quench my insatiable desire for blood. Please, please stop me. The answer is in the book. Those are the last words I heard from my uncle. I couldn't sleep anymore that night. I lay on my bed going over it in my mind what my uncle had said to me. How was I going to help him? A full moon was due the next night. I rose early that morning and went straight to the landlord to find out what he knew about the attacks on the villagers and their livestock. He told me that they were convinced that the evil emanated from the house of my uncle Obadiah, and that a group of them were planning to go there and burn it to the ground before anyone else was murdered. On hearing this, I decided I must return to my uncle's house. The driver of the pony and trap refused to take me, so I had to walk the 5 miles.
I arrived in the early afternoon, and my first thought was to find the book which was the cause of all this evil. Where in the house could it be? Where would he have kept it? I searched all the rooms and found nothing, and each passing minute brought the villagers closer. Then I had an idea that maybe he had kept the book in the crypt, in the place where he had found it, in the grave of Bernard de Riche. Picking up a lantern, I rushed over to the ruins, and remembering that my uncle had found the entrance to the crypt near the altar of the Abbey church. In the fading afternoon light, I worked out from the footprint of the ruins of the Abbey's church where the altar would have been and found an area of disturbed earth. Frantically brushing the earth to one side, I found the stairway entrance to the crypt. Holding the lantern before me, I plunged down into the darkness. The crypt was exactly as described, and at the end, farthest from the entrance stairs, was the grave of de Riche. Bernard de Riche's bones were still there. Reaching down, I felt into the mold for the skull. Brushing the damp earth to one side, there was its empty, hollow, sightless eyes staring up at me, causing me to shiver in horror. Forcing myself to put my hands into the grave again, where the skull had lain, I found the book. I left the crypt as quickly as I could, for the late afternoon sun was setting fast, and the full moon was due that very night. How's I going to release my uncle from this pact with Satan? For soon it will be too late for Obadiah, and the evil will once more be free to roam the countryside. From somewhere, Obadiah's last words came into my head, that he had said the answer was in the book. There were distant shouts and screams, and I realized the villagers intending to burn the house to the ground had by now reached the gates to depart. In shock, I dropped the book, and as if by guided hand it fell on the final page, and I found myself staring at the two words, Combaret Igni. I ran into the hall, and with all the rubbish, there quickly built a fire in a large stone fireplace, and as the last rays of the sun died, I hurled the book onto the fire. It sat in the middle of the flames for what seemed an eternity before it began to burn, and as it burned, the image of a huge howling werewolf began to materialize in the flames, and to my horror, stepped out of the fire and into the room. The huge creature stood there before me in flames, mouth wide open, emanating a horrendous growl. Its yellow eyes staring at me with such loathing and hatred that in horror I closed my eyes. The werewolf bit me viciously into my shoulder, and then it disappeared. The fire from the book went out, and in the smoke, I saw my uncle's face.
Thank you. Thank you for releasing me. I'm sorry it had to be this way, but it was the only chance for me to find peace. I'm sorry.
He used me. My shoulder bleeding profusely, I ran out to the villagers to assure them that the curse had been lifted, and there's no need to burn down the house. The villagers' eyes were terrified. As they looked at me, my outstretched hands now became sharp claws, and I could feel my teeth sharpening inside of my jaw. I hadn't noticed because of the adrenaline, but a serious pain began to burn within me as well. I was transforming into the werewolf amongst the villagers' very eyes. They began to shoot and threw their torches at me as well. As I was transforming, I pleaded with them to run, but it was too late for my transformation because it was completing. I am no longer man, but rather beast. I ripped the villagers to shreds. I was not in control anymore, but I was just a passenger in my own body, bearing witness to primal carnage. What have I become? There I stood, a gruesome towering beast of nightmare, my humanity seemingly swept away by the moon's unforgiving light. I made my way to the village, not in control of my actions at all, but moving so fast and so swift through the forest. I finally arrived to the main village, and the carnage did not end there. I feel the hunger of this werewolf, and there's no end to it. It's insatiable. He murdered everyone in the village. Hopefully some ran away while they could, or hid, but it was too late. The village square, once a gathering place for celebrations and friendly banter, was now a place of terror and devastation. My own screams, half human, half beast, tore through the night, echoing off the stone walls of the Abbey ruins and the wooden cottages. As a profound horror gripped me, I could feel the beast's impulses, its savage delight in destruction, but within, a tiny spark of my human soul screamed in agony and despair. This isn't what I intended, but this was what my uncle had hoped for. When he begged me to break his curse, he knew that I would be taken over. So here I am, more cursed than he ever was. As the night wore on, my frenzied rampage did not abate. The animal within me dominated, driven by a monstrous hunger and rage that knew no bounds. Yet, each glimpse of my reflection in a window or in the dark waters of the village well showed a visage twisted in sorrow and regret. I was trapped in a nightmare, forced to watch helplessly as I became the very terror I had sought to destroy. When dawn finally broke, the horror of the night receded like a dark tide, leaving behind a village in ruins and a populace decimated. I found myself back in human form, no clothing and shivering in the cold morning air. Amidst the destruction, I waited. The pain of transformation was immense, but it was nothing compared to the agony of knowing what I had done to those I had meant to protect. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the desolate scene, I stumbled back to the ruins of the Abbey, to the very place where it all began. I collapsed near the altar, where the ancient crypt lay hidden beneath layers of earth and stone. Tears streamed down my face as I grasped the dirt, my fingers digging into the ground as though I could bury my sins alongside the bones of Bernard de Riche. But there was no escape from what I had become. The book had burned, the curse supposedly lifted, but its legacy was now etched in the blood and shadow of my soul. A part of me that could not be so easily extinguished. I was bound to the cycle of the moon, a prisoner to its whims. The village would never recover from that night, and neither would I. With each full moon, I feared what I might become, what horrors I might unleash. There was no solace, no redemption, only the grim acceptance of my fate. As the beast, I was a creature of legend, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between man and monster. In the months that followed, I isolated myself, staying far from any who might accidentally wander into my path during those cursed nights. I searched desperately for a new solution, a way to end my torment and ensure that no one else would suffer as I did. Sometimes I even tried to end my own life, but then I would just wake up next to the altar. I won't explain how, but I've attempted in so many different gruesome, awful ways. It is inevitable, this immortality. It is also my demise. Thank you for listening to A Midnight's Tale. Please like and subscribe for more, and have a terrifyingly good night.